Let me just make a couple of points about this very complicated relationship that we have with China. First, there is some relatively better news. If you track the development of this relationship over the last several years, I was sworn in 2.5 years ago as ambassador, and that is that I think right now there's greater communication between the two governments than we had previously. You all know about the trials and tribulations in this relationship from the visit of Speaker Pelosi in August 2022, and we supported that visit. And I continue in debate and discussion with Chinese officials, even today, until today, say, you know, she was a leader of a co-equal branch of the United States government, and she had the right to go, and we supported it. But the Chinese reaction, of course, was very aggressive. The relationship was effectively shut down for a couple of months. And then after that strange balloon floated across the territory of the United States very slowly over 5 days in early February 2023, we went into another tailspin, not of our choosing, by the way, in the relationship. We believe that in this very complicated relationship involving security differences, military differences, technology differences, economic differences, and most profoundly, different conceptions of human freedom and human rights, you still have to have communication. We're the two strongest countries in the world, the two largest economies, the two strongest militaries, and so the idea that we wouldn't be talking together is destabilizing, and it's not responsible, and it's not rational. So over the past year, really dating back to the end of the first week in June of 2023, you've seen us reconnect. Secretary Tony Blinken has been there twice. Secretary Janet Yellen has been there twice. Secretary Gina Raimondo, Chuck Schumer, the majority leader of the Senate. I just saw him yesterday in Washington. He led the first congressional delegation in 4.5 years to China. And it's still the only congressional delegation we've now had in 5 years to China. And he broke that ice. And he played a major role. And of course, the major event was the summit meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping in Woodside, California, November 15th of last year, late 2023. And the two leaders agreed that despite our differences, we had to be talking to each other. And so we've done that since. You've seen our two military leaders come together just last weekend in Singapore at the Shangri-La Conference. Secretary Lloyd Austin met for the first time in person his Chinese counterpart. Chairman Brown, our new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has had a similar virtual meeting with his counterpart. We've got to have our two militaries talking together, given the very close proximity of our air forces and navies, in particular in the Spratly and Paracel Islands, international waters and airspace of the South China Sea, in the Senkaku Islands, Diaoyu Islands of the East China Sea, and of course in the Taiwan Strait, which is heavily contested. And so that's, in our view, reasonable and responsible that our two militaries should be in communication with each other. Second, we just started a nascent conversation on artificial intelligence. 2 weeks ago, our experts met at a fairly senior level with their experts in Geneva to begin a conversation on the risks associated with artificial intelligence connected to our two militaries. Third, I think as all of you know, since fentanyl is the greatest public health crisis in America, it's the leading cause of death of Americans 18 to 49. The majority of the precursor chemicals that make up the synthetic opioid that are made up by the drug cartels in Mexico, those precursors come from black market Chinese firms. And so we have prevailed. President Biden, Senator Schumer, myself, others have been working hard to convince the Chinese leadership, please help us to shut down the flow of those precursor chemicals. I can report to you now 6 months into those conversations that we have a new window of cooperation on counter-narcotics. We believe some progress has been made, but we need further progress to shut down the flow of precursor chemicals. And we are in intense work with the Chinese government to do that. We had not been working together for several years, and now we are. We think that is in the American national interest. And finally, when we think about diplomacy, And the relationship between two big, globally oriented countries, you have to start with people, because people are the foundation stone of any relationship. And what's been remarkable since the time that Winston accompanied President Nixon to China in that great trip that I watched as a 16-year-old in February 1972, our people have engineered a symbiotic relationship. The number of American students was at 15,000 as recently as 2015-16, but because of zero COVID and the pandemic, it's now about 880 American students in China versus 300,000 students, Chinese students here in the United States. If you think about tourism, there were millions of tourists, Chinese and American, going back and forth as recently as 2019. And tourism in the United States, by the way, Chinese tourism, is a $30 billion business. If you think about the state of California, New York City, Washington, D.C., very important to us. And what happened during COVID, particularly in the application of zero COVID, the PRC policy within China, our two societies were decoupled. And so the two presidents decided in Woodside, California, let's reconnect our two societies. And my mission in China, our embassy in Beijing, our consulates in Wuhan, in Shenyang, in Shanghai and Guangzhou, we've been working on this. We want more students to come back, American students. We'd like to see a return of flights. Another interesting data point, there were 345 weekly direct flights between the United States and China pre-pandemic. As of a year ago today, 12 direct flights a week. We're now up towards 100, so we're making progress. But you can just see how the two societies had become physically alienated from each other, and that's not good if you're trying to create a future where we're going to compete, but we want to compete peacefully with each other. So those were the four accomplishments of the San Francisco meeting: closer military-to-military interaction, progress on fentanyl, an initiation of a discussion of artificial intelligence, and reconnecting our two countries, the people of our two countries. I think we've done relatively well in returning the relationship to some semblance of normalcy just over the last 6 or 7 months. That's the good news this morning. The bad news, or maybe the real news, the real story of this relationship, if you think about it in 2024, if you try to think what it's going to be like in 2034, 2044, I make the assumption, and I'm not alone in this, I think it's accurate, that we're locked in a long-term strategic rivalry between our two countries. We are systemic rivals. We have completely different and opposite views about human freedom and human liberty. We have very different views about what's happening in Xinjiang and the repression there, what's happening in Tibet and the sinicization of the school system and of culture by the Chinese authorities in Tibet. We lament what has happened in Hong Kong, the dramatic turnaround in Hong Kong. I was with Secretary Albright, Madeleine Albright, our great Secretary of State, on June 30th, 1997 in Hong Kong. We were at the turnover. We remember the commitments that the Chinese government made to the rest of the world, but particularly to the citizens of Hong Kong. And those commitments were not met. And now Hong Kong, I was just there in March. Hong Kong is a very different place, and you see that in this, in the arrest and prosecutions of the democracy activists last week. So that's a profound competitive difference, human rights. Another is, of course, the military-to-military rivalry in the Indo-Pacific. The Chinese sometimes will say, members of the government of China, Asia for the Asians. And I point in discussions with them to the map. Look at Hawaii. Look at Alaska. Look at Guam. Look at American Samoa. Look at the state of California, Susan's home state, Orville's home state. We are a Pacific country. We're there too. We've been there. The Second World War on, and today's a day to remember the extraordinary effort made by the United States to win that war, D-Day, June 6, 1944. We commemorate the bravery of our soldiers on that day. And we also remember the effort we made in the Pacific. So that's the answer to the Chinese propagandists who say somehow that the United States is an alien force. To the contrary, historically, geographically, economically, politically, we're part and parcel of that region. And I think what President Biden has done very well in this rivalry in the Indo-Pacific, maybe extraordinarily well, I should say, the president, is to deepen our alliances with Japan, with the Republic of Korea, South Korea, with the Philippines, with Thailand, with Australia. He's created, President Biden, this very promising AUKUS initiative strategically to provide a stronger deterrent of the democratic countries, in this case Australia, the UK, and the United States, for the strategic future of our military forces. Think about the Quad. The fact that the Indian Prime Minister is at the table with the Japanese Prime Minister, the Australian Prime Minister, the American President. It's not an alliance, but it's a grouping of four significant countries that want to protect democracy and international law when it comes to the behavior of the government of China. So on the military security side, a real competition. Technology, I think, is another element or arena of competition, which in many ways is the heart of the competition. Big commercial competition now between the American and Chinese tech companies. Who's going to be first mover? Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum sciences. But we have to expect that those technological areas are going to be militarized, and that we're looking at a profound change in military technology over the next decade or so, and we do not intend to be number two in that race. It is supremely important that the United States, and you look at the investments we are making in terms of the industrial policy of the United States under President Biden, we are going to not just keep pace, we want to accelerate and exceed what the Chinese are able to do. Because we believe that the United States is an agent of peace and stability in our strategic alliances in the Indo-Pacific, and we do not believe that about the role of China bullying the Vietnamese, contesting the Philippine sovereignty, as they've been doing at Second Thomas Shoal and other areas, contesting, as the Chinese have done, their border with India in that long-running dispute along the border. And of course, we support India. And so it's interesting to see how many countries in the Indo-Pacific want a strategic relationship with the United States because of the assertiveness of the government of the People's Republic of China. This is a highly competitive relationship. And we have to assume that. If you listen to the rhetoric of the government in Beijing, it's often, we want win-win. Well, it'd be nice to have a win-win relationship. But at a time when the PRC has reached out illegally and expanded its physical military presence in the Spratlys and Paracels over the last 10 years, the militarization of the islands and islets there, against the sovereignty of 5 other claimants in the Spratlys and Paracels, that's a problem. And so we are in a competitive frame of mind. We make no excuses for it. It's the right policy for the United States on human rights, on technology, on trade and investment, on security. Last point, and then I look forward to a good conversation with Orville and with all of you. If you think about what I've just said, that we have a relatively more stable relationship, and that's good, and we can communicate more effectively between us. But we're also locked into a series of long-term strategic challenges between us, and that we are competitors and rivals. It's very important for me to conclude, and if we were to have a really serious discussion, we would all camp out here for several months and look into all these issues in a very deliberate way. But I think in essence, we also have to be responsible in this relationship, and we are. And so it's very important that as we look at the future, we do everything we can, both sides, to drive down the possibility or the probability of a conflict between our two countries. Because a conflict, a military conflict, would be catastrophic for China, for the United States, and for the rest of the world. That's why our militaries have to be talking together. That's why President Biden insisted on that at the Woodside Summit. That's why we call upon China to be an agent to seek a peaceful outcome of the cross-border dispute with Taiwan. That's why we call upon China not to be the aggressor it is in the Spratlys and Paracels, but we have to be custodians of peace for the future as well. So that is a summary, Orville, Susan, of the policy of this administration. I look forward to a good discussion with all of you, and thanks again, Madam President, for the invitation to be at the Age of Society.
Well, thanks for those remarks, and thanks to all of you for coming. One question which really I've been pondering for some time, and I don't have an answer to, and I'm wondering what your answer is. We used to have an era where peaceful rise was one of China's mantras. There was peaceful evolution, various other versions of it. We've glided off into a place where China has managed to offend, just to name a few, Korea, Japan, Canada, Philippines, India, even Sweden, Norway. I'm wondering, in your view, we're so used to analyzing foreign policy in terms of national interest. What national interest do you think the Chinese leadership sees as being served by these policies?
Good question. It's one of those questions we could design an entire course at Berkeley or Harvard or any place, Columbia, where Tom teaches. My own view, and I'm not alone in this, is that over the mid to long term, the Chinese leadership seeks to have China become the strongest power in the Indo-Pacific. So you see, particularly over the last 10, 12 years, this very aggressive move, illegal in the Spratlys and Paracels, to militarize islands that are claimed in some respects by 5 other claimants in the region, to see the constant presence of Chinese naval and air forces in the Senkakus, and to see the pressure that the PLA has put on our ally, the Philippines. So important to note here that the United States has a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines dating back to 1951, and Article 4 of that treaty confers on both countries the responsibility to protect each other. We have said publicly, when Secretary Blinken was in China with us last month, President Biden has said that Article 4 of that treaty is in effect, i.e., don't cross that line. The United States has treaty responsibilities. President Obama, President Biden, I believe President Trump too, also articulated that in the Senkakus, the United States has a treaty obligation to Japan. And so there have to be boundaries to Chinese behavior, but it's been very aggressive, Orville. Those are just 2 examples. I give you a third, which doesn't involve a treaty commitment per se, but it is the pernicious activities of Chinese companies that have exported to the Russian defense industrial base components, technology components, critical materials in a major way that has strengthened the ability of President Putin to prosecute this terrible war in Ukraine. We have just sanctioned 21 Chinese companies because they've transgressed American law that prohibits that. But we believe, as Secretary Blinken said when he came to China, and he said this publicly, that the activities of the Chinese government allowing this to happen have strengthened the Russian industrial base significantly over the last 2 years, and we've called on the government of China to stop Chinese firms from providing this material. They have not done so. That is a real problem in our relationship, and it kind of completes my answer to your question. The answer from the European countries, our allies in NATO, to the Chinese has been remarkable to see. You and I have both observed Europe's strategic view of China over, say, 3 or 4 decades, both NATO and the EU have now branded China a strategic rival because China is supporting Russia on an issue that it's existential for Europe. It's this brutal division by Putin of the continent of Europe and this attack on a member state of the United Nations, Ukraine. So the Chinese don't appear to really understand. I don't think they really grasped what they were doing in aiding Russia, that it would have this very profoundly negative impact on their relationship with Europe and with us, because we have told the Chinese the future of Europe is a core interest of the United States. The Chinese are fond of telling us Taiwan's a core interest, the South China Sea is. We have said,
I think you ought to let the ambassador continue to speak. I think you should allow the ambassador to speak, and we'll ask you to please leave the hall. I think we'd ask you to please be quiet and leave the hall. Yeah. Nick, let me just pick up the conversation before the intrusion here. I think the thing that still mystifies me was that China had actually a very good thing going with the global world, the marketplace. It was actually, people were quite comfortable and friendly towards China, willing to trade. What do you think it was that turned the worm to make them sort of activate in a very negative way these relationships with a lot of neighbors, but people elsewhere in the world as well?
Yeah.
Why did this happen? And what do you think went through their sort of minds to say, this is the right course for China to take?
Well, Orville, first of all, maybe I should just say, and it's the fair thing to do, that obviously everybody has a right to their own views, and the great thing that we love about our country is people get to stand up in a meeting like this and disagree. So I don't take that negatively at all. And that's important to say on June 6th as we reflect on what that really means. The bravery and the sacrifices that our parents' generation made, both of ours, a lot of ours.
We will ask you to please to be silent so that we can hear from the ambassador. If you have a question, could you reserve it for the question period? We'd be happy to entertain it.
I'd be happy to answer your question once we finish.
Yes. Would you please not disrupt the meeting and ask the question in the question and answer period? Otherwise, you are going to be escorted out. Yeah. Well, I think this gives us a suggestion.
I think I remember your question.
Yeah. This is a highly...
look, if people want to stay, I'm happy to answer any question like that.
Well, we're going to have questions in a short moment.
I think that in a way, I remember when I was being confirmed by the Senate, and one of the things that I ended up saying in that testimony that day is that the Chinese leadership had been, this is October 2021, Senate confirmation. The Chinese leadership had been saying quite consistently, the East is rising and the West is declining. They had literally been saying that in speech after speech.
Echoes of Chairman Mao.
Yes, but this was in 2019, 2021. They were repeating this prediction, and I think that's what they got wrong about Japan, about Germany, about the EU, about NATO, about the United States. If you think about the revitalization of our domestic economy and our industrial base, the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS and Science Act, the $369 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act for renewable energy, we've seen a revitalization of our economy, which is important in the contest for power with China. They got Europe wrong. For some reason, the Chinese leadership did not anticipate this furious pushback from Europe about China's support for Russia in this brutal war in Ukraine. They got us wrong. I've been observing and involved in the U.S.-Japan relationship since the 1980s. It's the strongest alliance we've ever had with Japan. To see the increase in defense spending, to see the seriousness of the Japanese on Taiwan, for instance, the revitalization of our alliance with the Philippines, and on. We've talked about it. I think the Chinese didn't see this coming. They've been surprised by it. They're going to have to deal with it. These are democratic countries standing up saying, we do want to live in peace. Just to answer what I heard there from those two people, we want to live in peace. But I think we've learned the lesson from the 1930s and 40s that you have to be strong and have a strong deterrence to keep the peace. And so that's a lesson we might reflect on from D-Day, June 6, 1944.
Well, I think we clearly are in a place where deterrence is the best answer we can come up with, deterrence that is as unprovocative as possible. But still, the question I don't have an answer for is, how did we get here? Get here, where we're talking about deterrence. Because we were actually in a world where we were all sort of benefiting by the global fabric and the global marketplace, and engagement actually seemed to be quite successful.
Well, I think, and you know this better than I do,
well,
I think we're a long way away from bide your time, hide your light. The reality of the last 10 to 12 years, maybe even going back to 2008, 9, 10, is a government in Beijing which has been extraordinarily assertive against its neighbors, many of whom are treaty allies of the United States or friends of the United States, like India. And so there's been a reaction, not just by the United States, by all those countries. And, you know, it is remarkable. Tom Christensen and I, Tom's professor at Columbia, had worked at a very different time. When I was Undersecretary of State for Condoleezza Rice and President George W. Bush, we worked with China in sanctioning Iran 4 different times at the Security Council. We worked with China, and Tom and I traveled together to Seoul and Tokyo and Beijing to sanction North Korea over its nuclear test. In 2006, we worked with China to try to stabilize Afghanistan in 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And that's all gone. It's not because we changed. I mean, I have to say this. It's not that President Obama changed or President Biden. It's that the Chinese leadership has a different view, and they're contesting other people's borders and presenting a security challenge which is quite profound. So that's why you've seen this reaction, I think, from the neighbors and from us.
So you mentioned that the Chinese leadership has changed, and I think we'd all agree. Why do you think this it did change in the way it has, when actually things were going reasonably well?
Well, you know, it's hard for me. I certainly can't speak for the government of China and don't want to do that. You've seen a lot of changes. You've seen the rise of the party, probably the decline in power relatively of, say, the State Council. You've seen the end of collective leadership. You've seen a China that feels very confident, or at least it did, about its own power. I remember a book written by my colleague Graham Allison, when I was teaching at the Kennedy School. He interviewed the great Singaporean leader, Lee Kuan Yew, about 10 years ago, I think. And it was Lee Kuan Yew who says in the book, in the interview with Professor Allison, China is clearly seeking to become the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific over the United States. There's a second question. Well, what are they seeking beyond that? Some people say, well, they want to be the strongest global power eventually. Well, the way to keep the peace, and this gets to some of the critical comments that people have a right to make, is to be strong, to be consistent, to support our allies, to have a strong military presence, as we must do, but to act responsibly too, and to have a greater degree of transparency between the two militaries, which we are seeking, and to openly declare, as I did this morning, we don't want conflict. If you track President Biden's comments on China, and you can just look them up, he almost always says in most of his, considered comments when he's talking about this, we don't want conflict with China. We're going to compete. We're going to stand our ground on issues that we believe in, but we don't want conflict. That's responsible. And we're just looking for the type of relationship where we can lower the probability of a conflict and yet compete, because we have to defend American national interests. And on the human rights side, technology, trade and investment, and certainly security.
I mean, as you sit in Beijing in the embassy and you interact with the Chinese government, do you think the United States should still assume it has a capacity to help shape what China does? Or do you think those days have vanished and we're simply in a world where we have to respond and deter?
That's a really good question. And I think, Orville, in a way, it traces the evolution. I served when I was Undersecretary of State at a time when we asked China to be a responsible stakeholder in the international system. Worked for President Clinton, not on China. I worked for him on Russia, but still President Clinton believed, and Susan was part of this administration, that let's have China come into the WTO. Let's integrate China, because if we integrate China, it'll be a responsible country. I think we're way past that. And I'm not criticizing, by the way, decisions that were made 20 years ago, 15 years ago, based on the politics and reality of those times. But certainly, if you look at the world, at Chinese behavior in 2024, completely different. Aggressive, dismissive of some of its neighbors, but also the greater repression inside China. So I don't think we're in a period of time where we believe we can suddenly change the behavior of the government, but we can change the environment, which is what we've sought to do in strengthening our alliances, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, but then to see Europe and work with the EU, for instance, in a strategic policy together in the Indo-Pacific, and to do the other things that President Biden feels are important: invest in our own country, strengthen our industrial base, strengthen our alliances, and compete on these areas that I've talked about. That's our policy, and that's the right policy, and it's really to form a different environment around China.
So how do you now look back on those halcyon years of engagement? Do you look at them as a good try, worthy, worth doing, a mistake? What's your attitude towards that sort of past period?
I think we were right to try to engage Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao. There were opportunities to engage. I presented a couple of specific examples. We worked pretty well with China. I was the lead negotiator on Iran for 2005, 2008, and we had a common view that both countries and the UN Security Council should sanction Iran for trying to become a nuclear weapons power. Those days are long gone. Was it the right decision to work with China? Yeah, we put pressure on Iran. We put pressure on North Korea with the Chinese back in 2006 and 2007. We had the six-party talks in 2005 and 2006, trying to get some progress on North Korea. And China, in many ways, was one of the leaders of that six-party talks. That was a different time. We were right to test the proposition that we could work with China. But then, of course, you have to be realistic when you see convincing, overriding evidence that China has changed and that it seeks a much stronger position in the world against our interests. We had to respond. And so you saw that from President Obama, you saw it from President Trump, and you've certainly seen it from President Biden.
But of course, as you alluded a moment ago, the whole Russian invasion of the Ukraine and China's relationship to Russia throws another spanner in the works here. How do you analyze that, and what should be done about it?
I'm smiling as you ask that question because I want to tell you an anecdote about Russia, China, and NATO. So I'm a former U.S. ambassador to NATO. I was there on 9/11 when the Allies came to our defense. That was an incredible moment when we invoked Article 5 and we felt the power of NATO. I was also there in 2003 when we created a NATO-Russia Council. Russia had decided it didn't want to become a member of NATO. Putin had mused about that in 2000 and 2001. So we created a partnership with Russia. They had a compound inside NATO headquarters. I met with Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador, weekly. All of us did. We gave Russia a chance to be peaceful in Europe. We also had a partnership with Ukraine in those years. So we didn't change. Putin changed. And here comes the anecdote. When you arrive in a country, well, let's say China, before you meet President Xi Jinping to present your letters of credentials from President Biden saying, here's our new American ambassador, you go over to the foreign ministry, and I had a 3-week quarantine back in the days of zero COVID. Came out of quarantine. My first act was to drive over with some of my team to the foreign ministry to meet the chief protocol. Now, normally the chief protocol is has a ceremonial job, and my job was to give him a copy of the credentials, have a cup of tea, have a nice conversation, and then leave. So we had the cup of tea. I presented my copy of my credentials. He said, I need to talk to you about one issue. I said, what's that? He said, NATO. And this is 1 month after Putin's invasion of Ukraine. This is late March of 2022. And he said, NATO caused the war. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was just focused on the cup of tea and the copy of the credential. And so we had a debate. And I said, well, you know, he's an ambassador. And I have great respect for him, by the way. I'm not making fun of him at all. It's just, it's a story that illustrates the problem. He tried to make the case that NATO aggression, as he called it, had led poor President Putin to invade Ukraine. And as a former ambassador and had lived the story of the NATO-Russia relationship, I debated him and he debated me, but I left and I thought, that's extraordinary. This is how it's going to be? We're going to argue over basic facts? I know the facts, and the facts are incontrovertible. So it's continued like that until today. If you look at Chinese government statements, they continue to say that NATO caused the war. It is a preposterous statement. But nobody believes it.
Dick, they also seem to be saying, and I think might say more and more, that it is the American alliances, American postures, which are forcing them in a way to, let's say, attack Taiwan, the Senkaku Islands, the South China Sea. In other words, that our provocation is what's going to force them into taking even more aggressive and belligerent action.
We have not been aggressive on Taiwan. Winston is here. The United States follows the one China policy first articulated by President Nixon in February 1972. As President Biden has said every time, including in formal statements, one China policy, we're sticking to that. We have not deviated from that. So for the argument to be made that somehow our actions have triggered a different Chinese posture, I think it's the reverse. South China Sea. You know, international law is important. Law of the Sea Treaty of 1972 is important. China has gone over the line. I mean, talk to the Vietnamese, talk to the Filipinos, talk to the Taiwan authorities, talk to the Malaysians, talk to Brunei, the other claimants of the Spratlys and Paracels. Talk to the Indian government about the Himalayan border dispute.
That's where Arunachal Pradesh is being claimed by China, and ultimately that shoe will fall.
Well, and you know, we've been very supportive of the Indians on this for several decades now, going back to the George W. Bush administration. So I would make the argument, Orville, I'm making the argument, we've been consistent, and China has a new policy, and so therefore we have to defend, as we are doing at Second Thomas Shoal, our allies.
So besides our efforts to deter, do you see anything that the Americans have failed to do that they could do, which might ameliorate the situation somewhat? Or do you see the preponderance of the responsibility lying on the other side?
So at one point in the Clinton administration, I was State Department spokesperson, so I learned a good lesson there. If you don't really want to answer the question you asked, you just answer the question you hoped would be asked. So with your permission, I would just say, I mean, I'm not here to say...
You're going to dodge my question.
I'm going to dodge the question. But I'm going to try to answer it too in this fashion. I honestly can't look back at the last three and a half years of the Biden administration and say, I wish we had done this or that. That's not part of my job. It's not constructive. But I will say this. What's important that we continue to do? I mean, a lot of our discussion has been about where we're opposed to what the Chinese are doing. And I stand by everything I've said. But we've got to continue to talk. That's what diplomacy is all about. We are dedicated to that. We are dedicated to hashing out these issues, at least being clear about our differences with the Chinese leadership. We want to drive down the probability of conflict. So getting our militaries together, supremely important. Secretary Austin took a big step towards that last weekend. That's important. What do we continue to do to stabilize the relationship? Because we assume this continued competition and disagreement for many years to come, well into the next decade. That's the responsible thing to do.
So compete, deter, but keep the door open. And of course, history does have a way of moving along, and things will ultimately change. We have to be, I think, ready for those changes to come in China, whenever they might be.
And well, that's another reason why you continue to talk. And it's a big reason why you you want to reconnect our two populations. You know, there are some people out there in our country saying, decouple the two economies. We don't believe that. We think that would be injurious to the global economy and our own, and China's. We are de-risking, we're shutting down national security trade, but I meet with American businesses all the time to help them to trade with China on a fair basis, and we certainly should not shut down conversations that are aimed at stabilizing a very difficult relationship. That we're diplomats, and diplomacy is a good thing in a difficult world like this.
Okay, we have some questions from the audience, and this is just apropos of what you've just said. How do we encourage and continue U.S.-China educational research programs in the U.S. and Chinese universities? How can we obtain more cheap solar panels? Well, that's a separate question.
That's a separate question. That's a more difficult question.
Let's get back to that, because that...
All right. I'll answer both briefly.
Yes.
Okay, so we've gone from 15,000 American students to 880. That's not in our interest. I worry about the 2030s and 40s. I won't be in the government, but we need to have lots of young American women and men who speak Mandarin, who've had an experience in China, working in our government, leading our corporations. So we need to get the American numbers up. I'm working on a retail basis, university president by university president. Please come back to China. There are just under 300 Chinese students in the United States. I was at the Harvard Kennedy School commencement, spoke there.
300,000.
Did I say 300?
Yeah.
There are just under 300,000, thank you, Orville, Chinese students in the United States. I said at Harvard Kennedy School when I gave this graduation speech 2 weeks ago, they're welcome in our country. Our door is open. We issued 105,000 new student visas to Chinese students last year. We're well ahead of that pace for the first 5 months of 2024. It is a good thing to have young people studying with each other and speaking each other's language, so let's agree on that. On the second question, which was the harder question.
Well, the solar panels.
Panels.
Let me frame it a bit, Nick, here. I mean, China controls something like, 90+% of all polysilicon solar panels, and we need them if we're going to get green. On the other hand, we are in a very vulnerable position if we don't have any capacity to produce ourselves. So what's your take on that? What should we do? Take them or not?
So our position is twofold. One, we object to the current strategy of the government in Beijing, which is to mobilize what they call the new productive forces. And that is to overproduce, sometimes by 2 to 3 times domestic demand in China, lithium batteries, EVs, solar panels, to give you 3 examples, to then take the excess production, and dump it, i.e. sell it below the cost of production in Canada, Brazil, Mexico, Europe, the United States.
Kill the productive capacities there.
The nascent industries in those countries, and we saw that happen in Europe with solar panels. So President Biden has just announced a couple of weeks ago a significant increase in U.S. tariffs, 100% on EVs, for instance, to make sure that we can develop in our own country a renewable industry that can help us to become more green and more environmentally friendly and produce new jobs without that unfair competition from the Chinese. You've seen the same reaction from the European Union, Brazil, Mexico, other countries. The Chinese are not going to succeed, and we call this overcapacity. That's what it's known as. But we have a right to protect our markets against this unfair trade, and it's dumping on our market.
All right, now we move to a somewhat more delicate question. If you were Xi Jinping, what would you do in order to improve your people's life and improve China's position in the world?
So, thank you for that softball, whoever
It's
asked
not
it.
actually a softball question.
It's kind of it's like a sinker. The other big lesson I learned when I was State Department spokesperson is never answer a hypothetical question. So, and I'm also a diplomat, and I've also got to survive in Beijing. And but seriously, as a diplomat, you explain and defend your own country's policy. You don't seek to get into the mindset of another country's leader and assume that you know everything they're thinking and nothing good can come of that. So I'm going to dodge that completely.
I understand. I think you're a good diplomat, Nick, and you're excused. Based on your presumably inside information, do you anticipate a major move, political, economic, or military, from China in the next 1 to 2 years? If so, what? Major military move?
Well, all we can do is look at Chinese actions and then trace them over time and then try to analyze intent. So what you've seen from our administration, from the United States government, is we're concerned about the bullying of neighbors, China's neighbors in the South and East China Seas. We're concerned about the truculence of many of the statements about Taiwan, particularly since the election of William Lai and then the inauguration of William Lai. Certainly concerned about the overproduction, very concerned as well about this Chinese company investment helping the Russians to prosecute the brutal war. So we see what's happening. We assume, if you look at Chinese statements on overcapacity, they've not given an inch. On Russian defense industrial base, we've not seen any alteration of their behavior. So we have to react. In the case of the Russian defense industrial base, U.S. sanctions against Chinese firms. We've done that in the last couple of weeks. In the case of overcapacity, in part, the tariff decisions of President Biden, which is absolutely the right thing to do. So that's how I'd answer that question. We don't have a crystal ball, but part of if you think about the utility of embassies and consulates, first order of business, take care of American citizens. First order of business. That's why we created them in the 1790s. Second, my job is to reflect the views of the United States government and messages and communicate them to the government of China. My job is to understand what the government of China is doing and analyze that and communicate that back to Washington. We don't have crystal balls, but there's been a consistently aggressive behavior on some of these issues that is clear to see. So you respond in the way that we've responded.
As you are now probably familiar, China's Communist Party's suppression hasn't stopped at Chinese borders. It has used diplomats and agents to blackmail and silence narratives not in its favor abroad. I think this question is asking about the efforts of the Chinese Communist Party to control the narrative abroad about China as well as at home. What are your feelings on that?
Well, you can take this question in a couple different directions. 2 quick points. One is we have not looked kindly on the Confucius Institutes that 10 or 15 years ago there were many across the university system in the United States, and our advice to universities has been these are not productive institutes. these are agents of Chinese government influence, and so you've seen us say that. The larger question is interesting, Orville. There's a battle of ideas underway. The government of China seeks to downgrade the international order that we helped to build after the Second World War, after D-Day, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the rule of law, the red line that one country doesn't have the right to invade another across its territory, as Russia's done in Ukraine. And there is an attempt by China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, other countries to undermine the basic order that we've established over 80 years to try to keep the world more peaceful. And we're onto that. So there's that part of the battle of ideas. Another part of it, which we have to respond to, is, you go into most hotel rooms around the world, on any continent, there's CGTN. They've put billions of dollars in Beijing into this vast influence network, propaganda network, and we've got to respond to that. In our embassy, we are on Chinese social media. We're on Weibo and WeChat with accounts. We'll put a speech by Secretary Blinken. We'll put something I've said on Chinese social media, and it's taken down by the censors. We change the title. We try to get it back on. Maybe it gets on for 20 more minutes or 2 more hours. It's taken down by the censors. Great Firewall means that most Chinese citizens don't know about Tiananmen. They don't know what's happening in Xinjiang in their name. They don't know what's happening in Hong Kong. And so we have a self-interest, and I think an obligation, to contest the battle of ideas. It's a peaceful battle. It's a peaceful contest of our ideas versus theirs. One thing I've done is to initiate on our social media platform, on Twitter, on X, a series called Conversations in Diplomacy. So I've interviewed Condoleezza Rice. What was it like to be in the civil rights struggle? We just put on the website this morning, interview I did with Jason Collins. This is Pride Month. And Jason Collins was the first major American athlete, basketball player in the NBA, to come out and say, I'm gay, and to do it while he was playing. I interviewed Jason, remarkable human being. And what we're just trying to show the Chinese people, and we try to get this on Weibo and WeChat, is to say, we don't think we're perfect. We, the famous words, we're seeking a more perfect union. But we are struggling, and we are doing well in forming a democracy where people have a right to speak out. Condoleezza Rice and her parents, African-American civil rights struggle. Jason Collins trying to speak up for LGBTQ plus rights. And we're just trying to show that side of American democracy, of free speech, of contesting ideas. People can stand up in auditoriums like this. I mean, that didn't bother me. We don't want to have them interrupt and prevent a discussion, but they have a right to speak out and criticize me. And that's not what's happening, obviously, in China. So we try to show that side of American democracy. Nonpartisan, by the way, too.